Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's video on why the Walking Dead finale was terrible. So based on the fan reaction and things I've heard online, I decided to add this addition to my review of the Walking Dead finale and decided to focus more specifically on the cliffhanger ending and examine why fans were so outraged by it. Now that my temper is cooled, I'll try to look at it from a more analytical eye and hopefully clarify my position and that of many other fans who took to the internet to voice their outrage. This video was suggested to me by Regender Dio. So I decided to squeeze this one in as I think there's a couple of things I want to clarify on why this ending enraged me so much. But first off, I have to start off with my standard spoiler warning of The Walking Dead up to the season 6 finale, but also a spoiler warning for Game of Thrones up to the end of season 5, as I'm going to be talking about that as well. So mainly I want to examine the concept of cliffhangers, as after the finale aired there was a large outcry on the internet that this cliffhanger ending was horrible. I was a part of that outcry, however not everyone felt the same way. Some people didn't mind this ending, and if you didn't have a problem with this ending, that's fine. It's a matter of opinion. Some people just have different opinions and may have liked this cliffhanger ending, and that's perfectly okay. But what I saw coming from the camp that didn't mind the ending was a lot of misunderstanding and straw man arguments about those who hated this ending. And I just want to clear a few things up. And the biggest one I saw was this prominent, very popular YouTube film critic who compared this ending to the cliffhanger ending in Star Trek The Next Generation in the episode Best of Both Worlds, when Picard was transformed into a Borg and Commander Riker gave the order to destroy his ship. Now, let me make an analogy to what I think this argument basically boils down to. So it's like talking to someone who hated 50 Shades of Grey and saying, well, how can you hate 50 Shades of Grey? It's a movie. You know what else is a movie? Citizen Kane. And that was awesome. So how can you hate 50 Shades of Grey? In other words, it's not that it was a cliffhanger, it's that it was a bad, terrible, poorly executed, far too gimmicky cliffhanger, and to compare the Best of Both Worlds to it, which is generally perceived, and rightfully so, as the best cliffhanger ever to be seen on television, is just like comparing Citizen Kane to 50 Shades of Grey. You compare the best to the worst, so it's a completely flawed comparison with no merit. The other comparison that I myself didn't see, but Regender Dio brought to my attention, is that there has been comparisons made to Game of Thrones Season 5, which ended on multiple cliffhangers as Sansa and Theon jumped off the castle wall in Winterfell, Jon Snow was stabbed to death, Daenerys got surrounded by a giant horde of Dothraki, Arya was made blind, and Cersei got a new champion to get her revenge on those who humiliated her. And to be fair, there were those who were upset with the fact that the season ended on so many cliffhangers, but there was nowhere near the outcry that there was for The Walking Dead, and rightfully so. Now, that's not because people are being biased and unfair to The Walking Dead, as I'm sure the people who bring up Game of Thrones are suggesting. It's because these cliffhangers were good and were done properly, whereas The Walking Dead cliffhanger was shit and completely bungled. And the reason why so many people were upset with the Game of Thrones ending on so many cliffhangers is a totally different reason, as well as people were simply thrown off because Game of Thrones typically doesn't follow that format, as typically the major event happens in episode 9 and the finale is the cleanup episode, and they simply tried a different format this year which threw a lot of people off. Whereas The Walking Dead typically ends their seasons on some form of cliffhanger, so it wasn't that it was a cliffhanger that people were complaining about, it was that it was a bad cliffhanger. Now, I keep mentioning that the cliffhanger was terrible, and you may be asking yourself, well, what makes it so terrible? So let me explain. For me, watching the episode, I was really enjoying this episode. I was really immersed in this world and totally sucked into the story. It's as if I was right there with Rick, Abraham, and the others as the saviors continued to block them at every turn, and it really brought the suspense. And then Negan came out and gave this speech, which was performed beautifully, and Andrew Lincoln, who played Rick, gave an amazing performance without saying a word, where you can tell how defeated and scared he was, and you felt like you were just right there with him. So, you know, if it was as if I was right there with them, feeling scared and worried, which is what any good TV show or movie will do. But as soon as they cut to the POV shot of Negan killing someone, it's as if I was riding along in a speeding car and all of a sudden someone flings the door open and throws me out. Instantly, I was no longer in the world with him. I was no longer along for the ride. I was suddenly and abruptly, extremely and painfully made aware that I was watching a scripted TV show with the writers very clunkily trying to build suspense and leave you hanging so that you'll tune in next year and so that people will talk about it and buzz over the internet about it over the break so that they can make more money. And to me, this is the pinnacle of bad writing. So, why was I thrown out of this world so abruptly? Well, because the way this ending was executed, which I think the best word to describe it is contrived. Because the way they cut from each person and the lineup with the bat in front of them is if someone was screaming in my face, "Ooh, can you guess who will die? Can you? And then they cut to the POV shot where you know someone died, but not who it is. And it is the biggest contrived TV gimmick you could possibly have. So rather than the best of both worlds or Mother's Mercy, I think the more apt comparison to make here, which I saw many people making, is Who Shot Mr. Burns? The Simpsons cliffhanger where Mr. Burns was shot and it leaves you guessing who it was. You know, it's pretty much just like that. However, in the case of The Simpsons, it's a silly comedy, a very good one, but a satire nonetheless. So it's when it does something hokey like that, it only adds to the humor, as it's pretty much poking fun at other shows that try to do this seriously, which is what The Walking Dead has become. So silly, it seems like a parody. Now, some of you out there may be saying, now wait a second, Mark. Who Shot Mr. Burns was actually based off of Who Shot JR, which was on the show Dallas, which was meant to be taken seriously. Yes, a prime-time soap opera from the 80s. In the past 30 years, TV shows have evolved and are geared towards being a bit more realistic and taken more seriously than they were in the 80s, where melodrama was more inherent in film and television. So either it's so silly that it's like a satire, or it's so cheesy that it's like an 80s soap opera. Either way, it is not good. But let's talk about the POV shot itself, because this kind of goes along with what I'm saying about it being contrived, because the POV shot itself is bad cinematography. Those type of shots are rarely used in The Walking Dead, and no, before you say it, it's not the same thing as the POV shots we got in the end term of this episode with the people in the van, as they were done more sort of artsy and cinematic. This was actually good cinematography. Well, honestly, watching the Negan POV shot was like watching an episode of Jackass or something like that. And plus, the way he was like, "Ooh, you're taking it like a champ," only added to the cheese factor. And so this was really bad cinematography, plain and simple. And the fact they would cut to this noticeably out of place bad camera work after an entire episode with good cinematography was really jarring in a very bad way. And what was made worse is the knowledge that the only reason that this was being done is so that they could leave you guessing in this really cheesy Who Shot Mr. Burns type mystery. Also, what's important to note is that this is strike two for The Walking Dead for using cheap and obvious gimmicks. The first one being earlier in the season when Glenn was shown being killed on the screen, only to find out 3 weeks later he wasn't killed at all, and it was Nicholas we saw being consumed by the zombies, and he hid under the dumpster for safety. Which has led to a common joke I see online that I never tire of, which goes, "Oh, don't worry, if you look really careful you can see Nicholas was the one being beaten by Negan, and the others will crawl under a dumpster for safety." Now, I said this then, and I'll say it again, that the fake out with Glenn's death was an obvious attempt to generate hype for the show, where the internet would blow up in a big way with everyone talking about The Walking Dead. And it worked. But did it add anything to the story? No. It wasn't done for story purposes, it was done strictly for financial purposes, which is the exact same case here. If you ask me, this offense is actually far worse, but either way, this had a cumulative effect on fans, as if they were willing to give the Glenn thing a pass. They're not so willing to do so anymore, because this is the second time that they did an obvious ploy to create controversy, and it takes away, rather add anything to the story. And many people also pointed out to leave a mystery like this at the end of the season in this day and age of modern technology and social media is a huge mistake, as the answer to who killed Negan will most likely be leaked online months before this episode airs, making the reveal of who Negan killed the very pinnacle of anticlimactic storytelling. But getting back to the Game of Thrones analogy, if we were going to use Game of Thrones as a comparison, the much more apt one, which I've seen several people give, is that it would be as if they ended Season 3 of Game of Thrones on the Red Wedding episode, and right after Catelyn saw Roose wearing the armor, you see the Frey soldiers getting their weapons out and ready to shoot, then they cut to black and end the season. Or if it would be like during the Mountain vs. Viper fight in Season 4, they spend the whole episode hyping the fight, and at the very end of the show, the two of them get ready to fight, and as soon as they charge at each other, they cut to black and end the season. These would have been cheap, gimmicky, bad cliffhangers, and arguably what The Walking Dead actually did was far worse because it featured a cheesy POV shot. But Game of Thrones hasn't and would never do something like this, which is one of the many reasons on why it is a far superior show, because even when they do cliffhangers, they give you enough resolution to keep you satisfied enough to enjoy the episode, but leave you hanging enough to be dying to know what will come next. This is the crucial balance that any good cliffhanger needs to have, and this one just failed miserably. Other examples of cliffhangers done right can be seen in the show Lost, that has an example of another of TV's best ever cliffhangers was in the Season 3 cliffhanger ending, where it's revealed what we thought were flashbacks in this episode were actually glimpses of the future to where Jack and Kate made it off the island, but Jack is filled with regret, which is a huge contrast to the rest of the episode where Jack is shown on the island desperate to leave it. It was such a dynamic and shocking revelation that opened up a can of worms of questions on what will happen next, while managing to resolve the storylines of that episode while still leaving things open-ended. Even in the Season 4 cliffhanger of Lost, where it was revealed John Locke was in the coffin, which was a resolution to a storyline introduced in the Season 3 finale, and not that they actually showed us who was in the coffin rather than ending the season right before it was revealed, and yet it was still a cliffhanger because we still had no idea how he got there. And that's something The Walking Dead could have done. They could have actually shown who it was getting killed and leave it open-ended on a cliffhanger of what will happen next, how will people get out of this, how will they deal with this death. That would have been so much more satisfying and so much more effective. In fact, you don't even need to look outside of The Walking Dead to look for a good example of cliffhangers. In season 4, it ended with Rick and his group being captured by cannibals and locked in a truck hold where they are likely to be killed, and Rick saying, "Ooh, they're gonna feel stupid when they find out that they're screwing with the wrong people." That was an amazing cliffhanger, with just enough resolution and mystery of what will happen next to keep people satisfied. So, let me reiterate that it's not that the season ended on a cliffhanger that people are so outraged, it's because it was a particularly bad cliffhanger that people are so outraged. Other examples people give of Star Trek or Game of Thrones are examples of good cliffhangers that got the right mixture of resolution and suspense without resorting to obvious gimmicks using poorly shot POV shots that have the quality of low budget B movies and the cheese factor of satire cartoons. It completely succeeds in completely destroying the perfect world of suspense and rich characters that this episode spent so much time establishing. In other words, it's horrible writing, plain and simple, that seems more concerned with creating internet hype and generating ratings rather than telling a good story. So that's it for my video on why The Walking Dead's finale was so terrible. Be sure to check out my channel for weekly reviews on Fear the Walking Dead, which I'll start next week. And I'm actually looking forward to it because honestly, at this stage, I really do think it's a better show. Also, check out my channel for many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Better Call Saul, Daredevil, Vikings, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.